The gavel was already falling when 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne stood up in Judge Prudence Weatherby's courtroom, his faded Batman backpack still strapped to his thin shoulders, and declared with a voice that cut through 20 years of legal precedent like lightning through darkness, "Your Honor, I need to represent my mama because her lawyer just walked out and we can't afford justice anymore." The packed courtroom fell silent except for the whispered prayers of his great-grandmother Clementine in the back row and the sharp intake of breath from his mother Serafina, who sat at the defendant's table wearing her only good dress, a forest green thrift store find that had seen better decades. Judge Weatherby, who had presided over family court since before Ezekiel was born and thought she'd witnessed every variety of human desperation, felt something crack open in her chest like ice breaking on a frozen lake. The opposing counsel, a predator in pinstripes named Bartholomew Sterling, representing Ezekiel's father Cornelius Thorne, actually had the audacity to chuckle, a sound like breaking glass in a cathedral. That laugh would haunt him for the rest of his career, because what 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne did next would shatter every rule in the legal handbook and prove that sometimes the most powerful arguments come wrapped in innocence and tied with unbreakable love. The truth that spilled from his lips would change everything forever. The morning had started like any other in the Thorne custody nightmare, which meant it began with tears before the rooster crowed and anxiety, thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Serafina stood in her tiny apartment kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd made with yesterday's grounds because groceries were a luxury she couldn't afford until her next paycheck, watching through the cracked window as Alabama's October sky painted itself the color of old bruises and broken promises. In 3 hours, she would walk into Judge Prudence Weatherby's courtroom knowing that her ex-husband's money and connections might steal away the only light left in her world, her son Ezekiel, who sat at their second-hand dining table practicing his cursive in a notebook held together with duct tape and determination. At 8 years old, Ezekiel understood more about legal proceedings than any child should have to learn. Late nights listening to his mama cry on the phone with lawyers who couldn't help her had taught him vocabulary words like custody modification and parental fitness evaluation, phrases that would determine whether he spent his afternoons doing homework at their kitchen table or pretending to be happy in his daddy's mansion across town, where love was measured in dollar bills and affection came with price tags. "Mama," Ezekiel said without looking up from his careful letters, his tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when he was working extra hard, "are you scared about today?" Serafina's coffee cup trembled in her hands like a leaf in a storm. How do you tell your 8-year-old that you're terrified beyond the capacity of language to express? How do you explain that his father, a man worth more money than some small countries, had decided that winning custody wasn't about love, but about proving he could take whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it, like a spoiled child breaking toys just to watch them shatter? "A little bit, baby," she admitted, because she'd promised herself long ago that she would never lie to her son about the important things, even when the truth felt like swallowing broken glass. "But you know what? Sometimes being scared just means something really important is happening, like when you're scared before a big test but you study anyway because you know it matters." Ezekiel nodded with the wisdom that comes naturally to children who've had to grow up faster than they should, who've learned to read the weather in their mother's eyes and navigate the storms of adult emotions with the skill of seasoned sailors. Like when you were scared to start nursing school, but you did it anyway because you wanted to help sick people get better? Exactly like that, sweet boy. Serafina knelt beside his chair and pressed a kiss to the top of his curly head, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence that no amount of legal battles could ever wash away. "Whatever happens today, Ezekiel, I need you to remember that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You are brave and smart and kind, and no judge or lawyer or courtroom can ever change that truth." What neither of them knew was that in exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, Ezekiel would prove just how brave and smart he really was, in a way that would leave grown adults speechless and redefine what it means to fight for family in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The Jefferson County Courthouse rose from downtown Birmingham like a monument to bureaucracy and broken dreams, its concrete steps worn smooth by decades of desperate feet climbing toward uncertain justice and prayers that sometimes went unanswered. Serafina and Ezekiel arrived early, not because they had any legal advantage to gain from punctuality, but because the city bus schedule didn't care about their anxiety and dropped them off with an hour to spare before their appointment with destiny. They sat on a weathered bench outside Courtroom 3C, Ezekiel swinging his legs that couldn't quite reach the floor while Serafina tried to read through her notes one more time, though the words kept blurring together like watercolors in the rain. Her court-appointed attorney, Octavius Mills, rushed past them with an armload of files that threatened to cascade to the floor at any moment and a look of barely controlled panic that did nothing to ease the butterflies performing acrobatics in her stomach. "Mrs. Thorne," he called over his shoulder without slowing down, his voice carrying the strain of a man juggling too many cases and not enough hours in the day, "I'll meet you inside in 5 minutes. Just remember what we discussed. Short answers, stick to the facts like glue on paper, and whatever you do, don't let Sterling get under your skin. He's going to try to make you angry, and if you lose your temper, we lose everything." Bartholomew Sterling, Esquire, was already inside the courtroom, arranging his files with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complicated operation and the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he cared about winning. At 58, he had built his reputation on dismantling families for the right price, and Cornelius Thorne was paying him very well indeed to prove that Serafina was an unfit mother who didn't deserve to raise the son she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Cornelius himself sat at the plaintiff's table looking like success had been tailored specifically for his broad shoulders and measured to fit his oversized ego. At 36, he had parlayed his daddy's construction business into a real estate empire that stretched across 3 states like a spider's web, and he wore his wealth like armor against any suggestion that money couldn't buy whatever he wanted, including the son he'd ignored for most of the boy's life. The irony, sharp enough to cut diamond, was that Cornelius hadn't wanted Ezekiel at all until Serafina started building a life without him. For the first 6 years of their son's life, Cornelius had been too busy acquiring property and conquering markets to notice that he had a child who needed a father's love more than a trust fund. But when Serafina finally found the courage to divorce him and demand child support that might help her provide for their son, Cornelius discovered that losing wasn't a feeling his ego could tolerate, so he decided to win. Not Ezekiel's love, that would have required actual effort and emotional availability that he'd never learned to provide. He decided to win custody, because in Cornelius's world, possession was 9/10 of everything that mattered, and love was just another commodity to be bought and sold like real estate. Judge Prudence Weatherby entered the courtroom at exactly 9 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of justice herself, though today justice felt more like a cruel joke than a noble ideal. At 61, she had presided over more custody battles than she cared to count, and she'd learned to read the emotional temperature of a room the moment she stepped inside. Today's temperature was Arctic, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the small gathering of family lawyers and court officials stood as one united in the ritual of respect for a system that didn't always deserve it. Ezekiel, sitting in the gallery between his great-aunt Magnolia and his great-grandmother Clementine, rose with the solemnity of someone attending a funeral, which in many ways he was. "Be seated," Judge Weatherby said, settling behind her bench with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's capacity for hurting the people they were supposed to love most. "We're here today for the custody modification petition filed by Cornelius Thorne regarding his minor child, Ezekiel Daniel Thorne. Mr. Sterling, you may present your opening statement." What happened over the next 3 hours would test every fiber of Serafina's strength and prove that sometimes the legal system's pursuit of justice can feel indistinguishable from its opposite. Bartholomew Sterling painted a picture of Serafina that bore no resemblance to the woman who read bedtime stories every night and saved quarters in a mason jar for Ezekiel's school field trips, the woman who worked double shifts to pay for his school supplies and fell asleep at the kitchen table helping him with homework because exhaustion was the price of love in a world that didn't value single mothers. "Your Honor," Sterling began in a voice smooth as aged whiskey and twice as dangerous, his words dripping with a kind of false sincerity that could fool anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "This case is about one simple question that cuts to the heart of everything we hold dear. What environment will best serve the interests of 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne, a bright boy who deserves every opportunity life can offer?" He paused for effect, letting his words settle over the courtroom like morning mist before delivering his killing blow. His mother, while undoubtedly well-meaning, has consistently demonstrated an inability to provide the stability, security, and opportunities that a child of his intelligence and potential deserves in this competitive world. Sterling presented evidence of every late bill, Every missed parent-teacher conference when Serafina had to work double shifts to keep the lights on. Every time she'd fallen asleep helping with homework because she'd been on her feet for 16 hours straight saving lives at the hospital. He made her dedication to her patients sound like neglect of her son, her financial struggles sound like irresponsibility, her love sound like inadequacy wrapped in good intentions. Mr. Thorne, on the other hand, Sterling continued, gesturing toward Cornelius with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick, can provide Ezekiel with private education at the finest schools, travel opportunities that will broaden his horizons, cultural experiences that will shape his character, and most importantly, a stable two-parent household with his new wife Evangeline, who has eagerly embraced the role of stepmother. The new wife in question sat in the gallery looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive perfume, beautiful, polished, and about as warm as a marble statue in winter. Evangeline Thorne, née Pemberton, 26 years old and possessed of the kind of Southern belle charm that could hide a heart of pure calculation, smiled at the judge with practiced sincerity that fooled everyone except Ezekiel, who had learned to read people's real intentions in their eyes. If you think this courtroom drama is intense, wait until you see what this 8-year-old boy does next that will leave everyone speechless. Make sure you're following this story because the twist coming up will absolutely blow your mind. Now, let's continue with what happened when little Ezekiel decided to take matters into his own hands. Octavius Mills did his best to defend Serafina with the passion of a public defender who genuinely cared about justice, but fighting Bartholomew Sterling with limited resources was like bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight in a hurricane. He presented character witnesses who spoke about Serafina's devotion to her son with voices thick with emotion, her colleagues at the hospital who testified to her work ethic and compassion that touched every life she encountered, her mother and aunt who'd watched her sacrifice everything to give Ezekiel a loving home built on something more valuable than money. But love, it seemed, wasn't enough when measured against private school tuition and trust funds, when weighed on scales that valued net worth over self-worth and bank statements over bedtime stories. The breaking point came when Sterling played his trump card, a recording that Cornelius had made during one of his rare visits with Ezekiel, a piece of evidence so devastating that it would have destroyed most mothers' chances of keeping their children. "Your Honor," Sterling announced with the satisfaction of a hunter who just spotted his prey, "I'd like to present Exhibit A7, a recording made by my client during a recent visitation, which I believe will demonstrate the toxic environment this child has been subjected to." The courtroom held its breath as Sterling pressed play on a small digital recorder, and suddenly Ezekiel's innocent 8-year-old voice filled the room through speakers that made every word sound like a nail in his mother's coffin. "Daddy, why don't you love Mama anymore? She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she says it's because you don't want us to be a family. Did we do something wrong? I can be better, I promise. I can clean my room more and not ask for toys, and maybe then you'll want to come home." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Serafina's quiet sobs and the scratching of the court reporter's pen recording every heartbreaking word. Sterling's smile could have powered the courthouse for a week as he delivered his interpretation of the recording with surgical precision. "As you can hear, Your Honor, this child is being emotionally manipulated by his mother, filled with guilt and confusion about his parents' divorce, and subjected to conversations that no 8-year-old should ever have to endure. This is clear evidence of parental alienation and emotional abuse." That's when something extraordinary happened. That's when 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne stood up in the gallery, his small frame trembling with righteous indignation, and did something that would change the course of legal history and prove that truth has a voice that can't be silenced by money or manipulation. "That's not what happened," Ezekiel called out, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a sword of truth through a curtain of lies. "That man is lying about my mama." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The bailiff moved toward Ezekiel, but Judge Weatherby raised her hand with the authority of someone who recognized that something profound was happening, something that transcended normal courtroom procedure and touched the very essence of what justice was supposed to mean. "Young man," Judge Weatherby said gently, her voice carrying across the room like a lifeline thrown to a drowning sailor, "what did you want to tell the court?" And that's when Ezekiel Thorne, all 4 feet 2 inches of him, walked to the front of that courtroom and delivered the most powerful legal argument anyone had ever heard, not because he understood the law, but because he understood love, and sometimes that's the only law that really matters. What he said next would echo through every courthouse in America and prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, delivered by the smallest heroes with the biggest hearts. "Your Honor," Ezekiel began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands that betrayed his 8-year-old nerves. "My name is Ezekiel Daniel Thorne, and I want to be my mama's lawyer because everyone in this room is talking about me like I'm not here, like I don't have feelings or thoughts or the right to say who I want to live with." Judge Weatherby felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the professional armor she'd built over decades of family court proceedings. She'd seen children testify before, but never like this, never with such clear-eyed determination mixed with heartbreaking vulnerability. "Ezekiel," she said gently, "do you understand what's happening here today?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied with the solemnity of someone far older than his years. "Daddy wants to take me away from Mama because he thinks his big house and fancy cars are more important than love. But I need to tell you something that nobody else knows, something that will change everything." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear hearts breaking in real time. Bartholomew Sterling started to object, but Judge Weatherby silenced him with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "What do you want to tell me, son?" Ezekiel took a deep breath, the kind children take before jumping off the high dive or telling the truth about broken windows. "That recording Daddy's lawyer played? He didn't tell you the whole story. Daddy didn't just turn on his phone and let me talk. He asked me those questions. He told me to say Mama made me sad. He promised me a new Xbox if I would cry and say I wanted to live with him." The silence that followed was deafening. Cornelius's face went pale as fresh snow, and Sterling looked like a man watching his career crumble in real time. "But I couldn't do it," Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if truth itself was giving him courage. "Because my mama never made me sad on purpose. She works so hard to take care of me that sometimes she falls asleep in her work clothes, and when I wake up in the morning, I find her covered with a blanket because she tucked me in first before she went to sleep on the couch." Serafina was openly weeping now, as were several spectators in the gallery. Even the bailiff had tears in his eyes, and the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw honesty pouring from this child's heart like water from a spring. "Your Honor," Ezekiel said, turning to face Judge Weatherby directly, "I know I'm just a kid, but I think grown-ups sometimes forget what really matters. My daddy has a lot of money, but money can't hug you when you have nightmares. Money can't sing you to sleep when you're scared. Money can't make you soup when you're sick or help you with homework when it's really hard." He paused, wiping his nose with the back of his hand in a gesture so achingly childlike that several people in the courtroom audibly caught their breath. "My mama does all those things, even when she's tired, even when she's worried about paying bills. She reads me stories every night, and she makes funny voices for all the characters. She teaches me that being kind is more important than being rich, and that helping people is more important than having things." Judge Weatherby found herself face to face with something rarer than legal precedent, more powerful than procedure, pure, unfiltered truth from someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Sterling, recovering from his shock, stood up with a cold calculation that made him worth $600 an hour. "Your Honor, while the child's testimony is touching, it's also inadmissible. He's 8 years old, clearly coached by his mother, and..." "Coached?" Ezekiel interrupted, spinning around to face the lawyer with fire in his young eyes that would have made angels weep and devils repent. "Nobody taught me to love my mama, sir. Nobody had to coach me to know that she's the best person in the whole world." The power in what happened over the next 3 hours would test every fiber of Serafina's strength and prove that sometimes the legal system's pursuit of justice can feel indistinguishable from its opposite. Bartholomew Sterling painted a picture of Serafina that bore no resemblance to the woman who read bedtime stories every night and saved quarters in a mason jar for Ezekiel's school field trips, the woman who worked double shifts to pay for his school supplies and fell asleep at the kitchen table helping him with homework because exhaustion was the price of love in a world that didn't value single mothers. "Your Honor," Sterling began in a voice smooth as aged whiskey and twice as dangerous, his words dripping with a kind of false sincerity that could fool anyone who wasn't paying close attention. This case is about one simple question that cuts to the heart of everything we hold dear. What environment will best serve the interests of 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne, a bright boy who deserves every opportunity life can offer? He paused for effect, letting his words settle over the courtroom like morning mist before delivering his killing blow. His mother, while undoubtedly well-meaning, has consistently demonstrated an inability to provide the stability, security, and opportunities that a child of his intelligence and potential deserves in this competitive world. Sterling presented evidence of every late bill, every missed parent-teacher conference when Serafina had to work double shifts to keep the lights on, every time she'd fallen asleep helping with homework because she'd been on her feet for 16 hours straight saving lives at the hospital. He made her dedication to her patients sound like neglect of her son, her financial struggles sound like irresponsibility, her love sound like inadequacy wrapped in good intentions. Mr. Thorne, on the other hand, Sterling continued, gesturing toward Cornelius with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick, can provide Ezekiel with private education at the finest schools, travel opportunities that will broaden his horizons, cultural experiences that will shape his character, and most importantly, a stable two-parent household with his new wife Evangeline, who has eagerly embraced the role of stepmother. The new wife in question sat in the gallery looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive perfume, beautiful, polished, and about as warm as a marble statue in winter. Evangeline Thorne, née Pemberton, 26 years old and possessed of the kind of Southern belle charm that could hide a heart of pure calculation, smiled at the judge with practiced sincerity that fooled everyone except Ezekiel, who had learned to read people's real intentions in their eyes. If you think this courtroom drama is intense, wait until you see what this 8-year-old boy does next that will leave everyone speechless. Make sure you're following this story because the twist coming up will absolutely blow your mind. Now, let's continue with what happened when little Ezekiel decided to take matters into his own hands. Octavius Mills did his best to defend Serafina with the passion of a public defender who genuinely cared about justice, but fighting Bartholomew Sterling with limited resources was like bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight in a hurricane. He presented character witnesses who spoke about Serafina's devotion to her son with voices thick with emotion, her colleagues at the hospital who testified to her work ethic and compassion that touched every life she encountered, her mother and aunt who'd watched her sacrifice everything to give Ezekiel a loving home built on something more valuable than money. But love, it seemed, wasn't enough when measured against private school tuition and trust funds, when weighed on scales that valued net worth over self-worth and bank statements over bedtime stories. The breaking point came when Sterling played his trump card, a recording that Cornelius had made during one of his rare visits with Ezekiel, a piece of evidence so devastating that it would have destroyed most mothers' chances of keeping their children. "Your Honor," Sterling announced with the satisfaction of a hunter who just spotted his prey, "I'd like to present Exhibit A7, a recording made by my client during a recent visitation, which I believe will demonstrate the toxic environment this child has been subjected to." The courtroom held its breath as Sterling pressed play on a small digital recorder, and suddenly Ezekiel's innocent 8-year-old voice filled the room through speakers that made every word sound like a nail in his mother's coffin. "Daddy, why don't you love Mama anymore? She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she says it's because you don't want us to be a family. Did we do something wrong? I can be better, I promise. I can clean my room more and not ask for toys, and maybe then you'll want to come home." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Serafina's quiet sobs and the scratching of the court reporter's pen recording every heartbreaking word. Sterling's smile could have powered the courthouse for a week as he delivered his interpretation of the recording with surgical precision. "As you can hear, Your Honor, this child is being emotionally manipulated by his mother, filled with guilt and confusion about his parents' divorce, and subjected to conversations that no 8-year-old should ever have to endure. This is clear evidence of parental alienation and emotional abuse." That's when something extraordinary happened. That's when 8-year-old Ezekiel Thorne stood up in the gallery, his small frame trembling with righteous indignation, and did something that would change the course of legal history and prove that truth has a voice that can't be silenced by money or manipulation. "That's not what happened," Ezekiel called out, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a sword of truth through a curtain of lies. That man is lying about my mama." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The bailiff moved toward Ezekiel, but Judge Weatherby raised her hand with the authority of someone who recognized that something profound was happening, something that transcended normal courtroom procedure and touched the very essence of what justice was supposed to mean. "Young man," Judge Weatherby said gently, her voice carrying across the room like a lifeline thrown to a drowning sailor, "what did you want to tell the court?" And that's when Ezekiel Thorne, all 4 feet 2 inches of him, walked to the front of that courtroom and delivered the most powerful legal argument anyone had ever heard. Not because he understood the law, but because he understood love, and sometimes that's the only law that really matters. What he said next would echo through every courthouse in America and prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, delivered by the smallest heroes with the biggest hearts. "Your Honor," Ezekiel began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands that betrayed his 8-year-old nerves. "My name is Ezekiel Daniel Thorne, and I want to be my mama's lawyer because everyone in this room is talking about me like I'm not here, like I don't have feelings or thoughts or the right to say who I want to live with." Judge Weatherby felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the professional armor she'd built over decades of family court proceedings. She'd seen children testify before, but never like this, never with such clear-eyed determination mixed with heartbreaking vulnerability. "Ezekiel," she said gently, "do you understand what's happening here today?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied with the solemnity of someone far older than his years. "Daddy wants to take me away from Mama because he thinks his big house and fancy cars are more important than love. But I need to tell you something that nobody else knows, something that will change everything." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear hearts breaking in real time. Bartholomew Sterling started to object, but Judge Weatherby silenced him with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "What do you want to tell me, son?" Ezekiel took a deep breath, the kind children take before jumping off the high dive or telling the truth about broken windows. "That recording Daddy's lawyer played? He didn't tell you the whole story. Daddy didn't just turn on his phone and let me talk. He asked me those questions. He told me to say Mama made me sad. He promised me a new Xbox if I would cry and say I wanted to live with him." The silence that followed was deafening. Cornelius's face went pale as fresh snow, and Sterling looked like a man watching his career crumble in real time. "But I couldn't do it," Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if truth itself was giving him courage. "Because my mama never made me sad on purpose. She works so hard to take care of me that sometimes she falls asleep in her work clothes, and when I wake up in the morning, I find her covered with a blanket because she tucked me in first before she went to sleep on the couch." Serafina was openly weeping now, as were several spectators in the gallery. Even the bailiff had tears in his eyes, and the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw honesty pouring from this child's heart like water from a spring. "Your Honor," Ezekiel said, turning to face Judge Weatherby directly, "I know I'm just a kid, but I think grown-ups sometimes forget what really matters. My daddy has a lot of money, but money can't hug you when you have nightmares. Money can't sing you to sleep when you're scared. Money can't make you soup when you're sick or help you with homework when it's really hard." He paused, wiping his nose with the back of his hand in a gesture so achingly childlike that several people in the courtroom audibly caught their breath. "My mama does all those things, even when she's tired, even when she's worried about paying bills. She reads me stories every night, and she makes funny voices for all the characters. She teaches me that being kind is more important than being rich, and that helping people is more important than having things." Judge Weatherby found herself face to face with something rarer than legal precedent, more powerful than procedure, pure, unfiltered truth from someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Sterling, recovering from his shock, stood up with a cold calculation that made him worth $600 an hour. "Your Honor, while the child's testimony is touching, it's also inadmissible. He's 8 years old, clearly coached by his mother, and..." "Coached?" Ezekiel interrupted, spinning around to face the lawyer with fire in his young eyes that would have made angels weep and devils repent. "Nobody taught me to love my mama, sir. Nobody had to coach me to know that she's the best person in the whole world." The power in that moment was electric, transforming the sterile courtroom into something sacred. Here was truth spoken without calculation, love declared without condition, justice demanded by someone too young to understand that the system wasn't designed to listen to children's hearts. Sterling pressed on desperately, trying to regain control of a case slipping away like sand through his fingers. Your Honor, this child has no understanding of legal standards, no concept of what's truly in his best interests according to established precedent. He's being manipulated by. I know what's best for me, Ezekiel said, his voice rising above the lawyer's objections with a kind of clarity that cuts through courtroom noise like lightning through darkness. What's best for me is staying with a person who would rather work 3 jobs than let me go to bed hungry. What's best for me is staying with a person who cries in the bathroom so I won't see her upset, who saves every dollar she can so someday we might have a house with a yard where I can play. Judge Weatherby watched as 8 years of wisdom poured from Ezekiel Thorne's mouth, each word carrying weight that legal briefs could never match. This wasn't a child parroting adult opinions. This was pure insight from someone who understood love in its most essential form. But what Ezekiel said next would change everything. What this 8-year-old boy revealed would expose a truth so shocking that it would send ripples through the legal community and prove that sometimes children see things that adults are too blinded by greed to notice. Your Honor, Ezekiel continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, there's something else. Something that Daddy and his lawyer don't want you to know. The courtroom held its collective breath. Cornelius started to stand, panic flickering across his features like flames in a sudden wind. 2 weeks ago, when I was supposed to visit Daddy, I heard him talking on the phone in his office. He didn't know I was listening, but I was scared because he was yelling, and when grown-ups yell, bad things usually happen. Ezekiel's voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on with the determination of someone who understood that this might be his only chance to save his family. He was talking to someone about money. He said that if he got custody of me, he wouldn't have to pay Mama any more child support, and he could claim me on his taxes and save thousands of dollars every year. He said it wasn't about wanting me, it was about winning and making sure Mama couldn't bleed him dry anymore. The courtroom erupted. Cornelius was on his feet, shouting objections, while Sterling frantically shuffled through papers trying to find some way to stop this 8-year-old from dismantling their entire case with nothing but truth and courage. That's a lie. Cornelius shouted, his carefully constructed facade cracking like ice in spring. Your Honor, my son is confused, he misunderstood. I'm not confused, Daddy, Ezekiel said, turning to face his father with eyes that held more sadness than any child should ever have to carry. I understood exactly what you meant. You don't want me because you love me. You want me because I'm worth money to you, like your buildings and your cars. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that settles over sacred ground where truth has been spoken and lies have been burned away like morning mist. Judge Weatherby looked from Ezekiel to his mother, then to Cornelius, whose face had gone ashen as old bones, but Ezekiel wasn't finished. This remarkable little boy had one more truth to share, one final revelation that would prove beyond any doubt where his heart belonged and why some bonds can never be broken by money or manipulation. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady now, clear as a bell on Sunday morning, I want to tell you about the night Mama got really sick last month. Seraphina's eyes widened in alarm. She started to stand, to stop her son from sharing something so personal, but Octavius Mills gently pressed her back into her seat, recognizing that Ezekiel was building towards something important. Mama had to work a double shift at the hospital because someone called in sick, and when she came home, she was so tired she could barely stand up. But I had a fever, and I was throwing up, and I was scared. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word from this extraordinary child who was teaching them all what love really looked like when stripped of pretense and legal jargon. Mama didn't go to sleep even though she was exhausted. She stayed up all night taking care of me. She made me soup and held my head when I was sick and sang to me until the fever broke. And you know what? She never once complained. She never once said she was too tired or that I was too much trouble. Ezekiel's voice grew thick with emotion, But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. This was his moment to speak for every child who'd ever been caught in the middle of adult wars, every kid who'd ever been used as a weapon instead of treasured as a gift. The next morning, when I felt better, I found her asleep sitting up in the chair next to my bed. She had been watching me all night to make sure I was okay. That's when I knew that my mama would never leave me, no matter what. She would fight dragons for me. She would move mountains for me. She would work herself to death for me. Judge Weatherby felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. In 23 years on the bench, she'd never heard testimony that cut so directly to the heart of what family really meant. "And that's why I want to be her lawyer today," Ezekiel concluded, his 8-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen love in its purest form and refused to let anyone diminish it. Because sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones who fight the hardest to keep you, even when they don't have fancy lawyers or lots of money. Sometimes love is enough. Sometimes love is everything. The courtroom was completely still, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a child's heart speaking truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could challenge or diminish. Judge Weatherby looked at Ezekiel standing there in his worn sneakers and carefully combed hair, this little boy who had just delivered the most powerful closing argument she'd ever heard, and she knew that her decision had been made not by law books or precedent, but by something far more fundamental, the recognition of pure, unconditional love. But before she could render her verdict, the courtroom doors burst open with a sound like thunder, and what walked through those doors would turn this already extraordinary case into something that would be talked about in law schools for generations to come. If you think this story couldn't get any more incredible, you haven't seen anything yet. What just walked into that courtroom will leave you absolutely speechless and prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Make sure you're subscribed because the next revelation will blow your mind completely. Dr. Isadora Blackthorne, child psychology specialist at Birmingham Children's Hospital, rushed into the courtroom with an urgency that made everyone turn in their seats like sunflowers following the light. Her usually perfect professional demeanor was replaced by something raw and desperate, a doctor who just discovered that one of her most important patients was in immediate danger. "Your Honor," Dr. Blackthorne called out, slightly out of breath from running through courthouse corridors, her briefcase clutched against her chest like armor. "I apologize for this highly irregular interruption, but I have critical information regarding this case that cannot wait another moment." Judge Weatherby's eyebrows rose like question marks drawn in surprise. In 23 years, she'd never had a medical professional burst into her courtroom like an action movie hero carrying life-or-death intelligence. "Dr. Blackthorne, I presume? You were scheduled to testify as a character witness next week." "Yes, Your Honor. But circumstances have changed dramatically in the last 24 hours. I've just received Ezekiel's complete psychological evaluation results, along with records from his previous pediatrician in Mobile, records that should have been part of this case from the very beginning but were somehow mysteriously delayed." Sterling was on his feet faster than a shark sensing blood in the water, his expensive suit crackling with nervous energy. "Objection. This is highly irregular and prejudicial. New evidence can't simply be introduced in the middle of proceedings without proper—" "Sit down and shut up," Judge Weatherby commanded with a voice that could stop tornadoes and make grown men weep. Something in Dr. Blackthorne's manner suggested this wasn't a courtroom game but a matter of genuine urgency that transcended normal procedure. "Doctor, what information could be so critical that it couldn't wait for scheduled testimony?" Dr. Blackthorne opened her briefcase with hands that trembled not from nervousness but from barely contained fury, the righteous anger of a medical professional who discovered that a child had been placed in danger by adult machinations. "Your Honor, Ezekiel Thorne isn't just a remarkably articulate and emotionally intelligent child. According to these newly obtained records, he has been living with undiagnosed high-functioning autism spectrum disorder for most of his life, and the stress of this prolonged custody battle is causing him severe psychological damage that could have permanent consequences." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps like wind through autumn leaves. Serafina's face went white as fresh snow, while Cornelius looked as if he'd been struck by lightning from a clear sky. Ezekiel, still standing near the judge's bench, tilted his head with curiosity rather than concern, processing this information the way he processed everything else, with remarkable calm and intelligence that now made perfect sense. Furthermore, Dr. Blackthorne continued, her professional voice cutting through the courtroom noise like a scalpel through infected tissue, these records show that Ezekiel has been essentially functioning as his mother's emotional support system and household manager since his father abandoned the family. He's been carrying responsibilities that would challenge most adults, and he's been doing it because he understands, on an intuitive level, that his mother's well-being directly impacts his own survival. Judge Weatherby felt the case shifting. On the contrary, Your Honor, Dr. Blackthorne replied with the passion of someone who dedicated her life to understanding the minds of children. I'm saying that his testimony is even more remarkable because of his condition. Children with high-functioning autism often possess extraordinary abilities to detect deception, process truth, and understand emotional authenticity in ways that neurotypical individuals cannot match. Custody battle was never about love or a child's best interests. It was about money, power, and a man's inability to accept that he couldn't buy what mattered most. Finally, Your Honor, I must inform the court that during my evaluation sessions with Ezekiel, he revealed details about conversations he'd overheard between his father and stepmother that suggest this entire custody petition may be fraudulent. Judge Weatherby leaned forward in her chair, her attention focused like a laser beam. What kind of conversations? Dr. Blackthorne consulted her notes, though it was clear she had memorized every devastating detail. Ezekiel told me that his stepmother, Evangeline, has repeatedly expressed to his father that she doesn't want children in their home. According to the boy, she told Mr. Thorne that winning custody would only be temporary, just long enough to eliminate the child support payments and establish a tax advantage. After that, they planned to send Ezekiel to boarding school so he wouldn't interfere with their lifestyle. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the horrifying implications of what had just been revealed. Here was an 8-year-old boy who had been used as a pawn in a financial game, a child whose own father was willing to traumatize him just to save money and stroke his ego. Ezekiel, who had been listening to all of this with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the adults in his life, finally spoke up in a voice so quiet it barely carried across the room. Is that why Evangeline always looks at me like I'm something yucky she stepped in? The question, delivered with such innocent honesty, broke something in Judge Weatherby's heart. She looked at this remarkable little boy who had endured more emotional manipulation and adult selfishness than most people face in a lifetime, and she knew that her decision wasn't just about custody, it was about justice in its most fundamental form. Dr. Blackthorne, Judge Weatherby said, her voice heavy with the weight of 23 years of difficult decisions, in your professional opinion, what would be in Ezekiel's best interests? The doctor looked directly at Serafina, then at Ezekiel, and finally at Judge Weatherby with the certainty of someone who'd spent her career studying the mysteries of children's hearts. Your Honor, this child belongs with his mother. Not because she's perfect, no parent is, but because she loves him unconditionally and has proven over and over that she will sacrifice everything for his well-being. The bond between them is authentic, healthy, and absolutely unbreakable. She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom like benediction. Removing Ezekiel from his mother's care would be nothing short of psychological abuse, and I would be ethically obligated to report it as such to Child Protective Services. Judge Weatherby nodded slowly, then turned her attention to the man who had started this entire legal nightmare. Man who just watched his empire crumble in real time. For the first time in his adult life, money couldn't fix his problems, and power couldn't bend reality to his will. What happened next would determine not just where Ezekiel would live, but whether justice could triumph over greed and whether love could defeat legal manipulation in a system that too often forgot what it was supposed to protect. The answer came from the most unexpected source of all, an 8-year-old boy who had one final truth to share that would change everything forever. Cornelius Thorne stood up slowly, his expensive suit suddenly looking like costume jewelry on a street performer. The mask of righteous fatherhood he'd worn for months was cracking, revealing the cold calculation underneath. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth he displayed during supervised visits, none of the fake concern he performed for the court. Your Honor, he began, his words dripping with barely controlled rage. "This is all nonsense. Hearsay from a disturbed child who's been poisoned against me by his vindictive mother. I'm a successful businessman who can provide opportunities that—" "Daddy, stop." 2 words. Just 2 quiet words from Ezekiel, but they cut through Cornelius's rant like a sword through silk. The courtroom fell silent as this 8-year-old boy walked closer to his father, close enough to see the truth in his eyes, close enough to speak directly to whatever was left of the man's soul. "I know you don't love me, Daddy. I've always known." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, burning away the last pretense that this custody battle had anything to do with fatherly affection. Cornelius opened his mouth to protest, but Ezekiel held up one small hand with surprising authority. "You want to know how I know? Because love isn't something you can fake, not to kids. Kids can tell when hugs are real and when they're just for show. Kids can tell when someone is happy to see them or just pretending because they have to." Ezekiel's voice grew stronger with each word, as if years of stored-up truth were finally finding their way to the surface. "Every time you picked me up for visits, you looked at your watch first. Every time we went places, you talked on your phone instead of talking to me. Every time I tried to tell you about school or my friends, you said, 'That's nice,' without listening." The courtroom was completely silent now, witnessing something extraordinary, a child speaking truth to power with courage that most adults could never summon. Judge Weatherby found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word from this remarkable little boy. "But you know what, Daddy? I forgave you for all of that because Mama taught me that sometimes people don't know how to show love, and maybe you just needed time to learn how to be a real father." Serafina was weeping openly now, her heart breaking for the son who'd carried this burden of understanding far too heavy for his small shoulders. Even some of the court officials were wiping their eyes, moved by the grace and wisdom pouring from this child's heart. "But then I heard that phone call," Ezekiel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "And I realized you weren't trying to learn how to love me. You were trying to figure out how to use me. Cornelius, I heard you tell that man on the phone that kids are expensive, that Mama was bleeding you dry with child support, and that if you could just get custody, you could make the payments stop and claim me as a tax deduction. You said I was worth about $15,000 a year to you in savings." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. $15,000. That's what this man valued his son at, not as a person to love, but as a line item on a tax return. "You said the best part was that once you got custody, you could send me away to boarding school and Evangeline wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. You laughed, Daddy. You laughed when you said that." Judge Weatherby felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. In 23 years on the bench, she'd seen custody cases motivated by spite, by revenge, by wounded pride. But she'd never seen anything quite this calculated, this purely mercenary. Ezekiel turned to face the judge, his 8-year-old face wet with tears but his voice steady as bedrock. "Your Honor, I don't want to live with someone who thinks I'm worth $15,000. I want to live with someone who thinks I'm priceless." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that settles over holy ground where truth has been spoken and lies have been burned away like morning mist. Everyone in that courtroom understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just a child's testimony, but a master class in human dignity delivered by someone who hadn't even learned to tie his shoes properly yet. But Ezekiel wasn't finished. This remarkable little boy had one more revelation that would seal his father's fate and prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. "There's something else, Your Honor. Something that proves Daddy never really wanted me at all." He reached into his Batman backpack with the careful precision of someone retrieving treasure, and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same type that Sterling had used to play the manipulated conversation earlier. "I learned how to use this from watching Daddy's lawyer. And when Daddy came to pick me up last week, I recorded our whole visit because I wanted to understand why he was trying so hard to take me away from Mama when he never seemed to want me before." Sterling was on his feet, panic written across his face like neon signs. "Your Honor, this is completely inadmissible. The child had no right to. Overruled, Judge Weatherby said with a voice that could have stopped hurricanes. Let the boy speak. Ezekiel pressed play, and suddenly the courtroom was filled with voices that would destroy any remaining doubt about Cornelius Thorne's true motivations. The recording was crystal clear, capturing every damning word of a conversation that had taken place in the front seat of a luxury car while an 8-year-old boy sat in the back, invisible and forgotten. Cornelius's voice came through the speakers. Look, Ez, I need you to understand something. Your mother is trying to paint me as a bad father, but the truth is, I'm trying to save you from a life of poverty and limitation. Then came Ezekiel's small voice, hopeful and trusting. Are you going to come to my school play next month? I'm playing a tree, and Mama said you might want to see it. We'll see, kid. The important thing right now is that too much and doesn't have time for you. But that's not true, Daddy. Mama always has time for me. Ezekiel, listen to me. Cornelius's voice grew sharp, taking on the tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Do you want to keep living in that tiny apartment, wearing second-hand clothes, eating cheap food? Or do you want to live in a big house with a pool and your own room and all the video games you could ever want? I like our apartment. And Mama makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the world. There was a pause on the recording, filled with the sound of Cornelius's frustrated sigh. You're not understanding the big picture here, son. This isn't about what you want. This is about what's practical. Your mother can't provide for you the way I can. But she loves me, Daddy. Don't you love me too? The silence that followed that innocent question lasted an eternity. When Cornelius finally answered, his words would haunt that courtroom forever. Love doesn't pay for college, Ezekiel. Love doesn't buy opportunities. Love is just a feeling, and feelings don't matter in the real world. What matters is winning. The recording continued, but Judge Weatherby had heard enough. She watched as the man who'd claimed to be fighting for his son's best interests was exposed as someone who saw children as possessions, love as weakness, and family as nothing more than a business transaction. But the most devastating moment was yet to come. The recording captured Ezekiel's final question, asked in the voice of a child whose heart was breaking in real time. Daddy, if you in custody of me, will you love me then? Cornelius's answer would echo through that courtroom for years to come, a testament to the breathtaking cruelty that some adults are capable of inflicting on their own children. I'll provide for you, Ezekiel. That's what fathers do. Love is something your mother filled your head with because she doesn't understand how the world really works. The recording ended, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Ezekiel carefully put the recorder back in his backpack, then looked up at Judge Weatherby with eyes that held more wisdom than most adults ever acquire. Your Honor, I think that answers your question about where I belong. Judge Weatherby felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks for the first time in her judicial career. She looked at Cornelius Thorne, this man who'd just been exposed as someone capable of weaponizing his own child's love, and she knew that her decision would be about more than custody. It would be about protecting innocence from the kind of emotional violence that money could never heal. Cornelius was standing now, his face red with rage and humiliation, all pretense of caring fatherhood abandoned. Your Honor, this is entrapment. My son has been coached to. Sit down and shut your mouth, Judge Weatherby commanded with a voice that made the bailiff reach instinctively for his handcuffs. You've said quite enough, Mr. Thorne. More than enough. She turned her attention to Ezekiel, this extraordinary 8-year-old who had just delivered the most powerful legal argument she'd ever heard, not through knowledge of law, but through pure, unfiltered truth. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded with the solemnity of someone delivering a final verdict. Yes, ma'am. I want to tell everyone here what real love looks like, because I think some people have forgotten. What Ezekiel said next would become legendary in legal circles, quoted in law schools and family courts across the nation as the perfect definition of what family was supposed to mean. Real love is when someone chooses you every single day, even when it's hard. Real love is when someone works 2 jobs so you can have school supplies, even when they're so tired they can barely stand. Real love is when someone reads you the same bedtime story 100 times because it makes you happy, even though they've memorized every word. His voice grew stronger, filled with the certainty of someone who'd experienced unconditional love and refused to let anyone diminish it. Real love is when someone believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. Real love is when someone fights for you even when the whole world says they can't win. Real love is my mama, and no amount of money will ever be enough to buy what we have. The courtroom was absolutely still, every person present understanding that they had just witnessed something sacred, a child's definition of love so pure and true that it stripped away all the legal complications and reduced the case to its essence. Where did this boy belong? Judge Weatherby knew her answer. She'd known at the moment Ezekiel had first stood up to speak, but now she was certain beyond any doubt. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about protecting something precious and rare in a world that too often forgot what really mattered. "I've heard enough," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of 23 years of difficult decisions. "I'm ready to render my verdict." But before she could speak those life-changing words, the courtroom doors burst open one final time, and what entered would turn this already extraordinary case into something that would be remembered for generations. A twist so shocking that it would prove that sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. If you think this story has already blown your mind, wait until you see what just walked through those courtroom doors. This final twist will leave you absolutely speechless and prove that sometimes justice comes from places you'd never expect. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about this case. FBI Special Agent Victoria Hawthorne strode into the courtroom with the purposeful stride of someone carrying federal authority and life-changing information. Behind her came two more agents, their presence transforming the family court proceeding into something that felt more like a criminal investigation. The badges and credentials they displayed caught the courtroom, lighting like shields of justice reflecting truth. "Your Honor," Agent Hawthorne announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a knife through silk, "I apologize for this dramatic interruption, but I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Cornelius Thorne on charges of tax evasion, fraud, and money laundering. This custody case has inadvertently exposed evidence of federal crimes that have been under investigation for the past 8 months." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators gasped and whispered. Sterling looked like a man watching his worst nightmare come to life, and Cornelius went pale as fresh snow, understanding. Furthermore, Agent Hawthorne continued, consulting a thick file that looked ominous enough to sink battleships, "Our investigation has revealed that Mr. Thorne has been hiding assets in offshore accounts while claiming financial hardship to avoid child support payments. The irony is that his own recorded statements about using his son for tax benefits provided the final evidence we needed to build our case." Judge Weatherby felt the universe shifting around her like pieces of a cosmic puzzle, falling into perfect alignment. "Agent Hawthorne, how does this federal investigation relate to the custody matter before my court?" The FBI agent's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Your Honor, Mr. Thorne's financial records show that he's worth approximately $47 million, not the modest income he's been reporting to this court. He's been deliberately impoverishing himself on paper while maintaining a lavish lifestyle, all to avoid paying child support to Mrs. Thorne." She turned to face Cornelius directly, her eyes blazing with the righteous fury of federal law enforcement confronting tax fraud. "Mr. Thorne owes approximately $230,000 in back child support, plus interest and penalties. His assets will be frozen pending trial, and a significant portion will be liquidated to satisfy his obligations to his son." The numbers hit the courtroom like physical blows. $230,000. Money that could have provided security, education, health care, and opportunities for Ezekiel. Money that his father had hidden away while forcing his mother to work multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. Serafina looked like someone who'd just been told she'd won the lottery and discovered buried treasure on the same day. Not because of the money itself, but because justice was finally being served to the man who tried to use their son as a weapon. But Agent Hawthorne wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would prove that Ezekiel's innocent recording had accomplished something far greater than winning a custody case. It had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached much deeper than anyone had imagined. Your Honor, our investigation also uncovered evidence that Mr. Thorne has been systematically defrauding business partners and investors for years. The arrogance and disregard for law that he displayed in his treatment of his own child appears to be part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. She held up a second file, this one even thicker than the first. Phone records, financial documents, and witness statements paint a picture of a man who believes rules don't apply to him, whether they're family court orders for child support or federal laws about tax reporting and fiduciary responsibility. Cornelius finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. This is a setup. My ex-wife planned this whole thing too. Mr. Thorne, Agent Hawthorne interrupted with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. Your ex-wife had nothing to do with our investigation. You did this to yourself through your own greed and stupidity. The recording your son made simply confirmed what our financial forensics team had already discovered. The irony was perfect, cosmic in its justice. Cornelius had tried to manipulate his son into helping him avoid financial responsibility, but instead, that same child had provided the evidence that would hold him accountable for years of criminal behavior. Ezekiel, still standing near the judge's bench, looked up at Agent Hawthorne with the curiosity of someone trying to understand how adult consequences worked. Does this mean my daddy is in trouble for being mean about money? Agent Hawthorne's expression softened as she looked down at this remarkable 8-year-old, who'd unwittingly helped the FBI solve a complex financial crimes case. Yes, sweetheart. Your daddy broke very serious rules about money, and now he has to face the consequences. But the most important thing is that you and your mama are going to be okay. Judge Weatherby felt like she was presiding over divine intervention rather than a custody hearing. Everything that had seemed impossible just hours ago, justice for Serafina, security for Ezekiel, consequences for Cornelius, was falling into place with mathematical precision. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 23 years of watching powerful men escape consequences for their actions. In light of these federal charges and the evidence presented today, I am not only denying your petition for custody modification, but I am also ordering supervised visitation only, contingent upon your compliance with all court orders and federal law. She turned to address the courtroom, knowing that her words would be quoted in law journals and family court training seminars for decades to come. This case has reminded us all that the best interests of the child must always supersede financial considerations, legal maneuvering, and adult ego. Love cannot be measured in bank statements, and family cannot be purchased with legal fees. But Judge Weatherby wasn't finished. She had one more pronouncement that would ensure Ezekiel's future was protected from any further manipulation by adults who'd forgotten what parenting was supposed to mean. Furthermore, I am establishing a trust fund for Ezekiel Thorne, to be funded by the back child support owed by his father, plus interest and penalties. This money will be held in trust for his education and well-being, administered by an independent trustee, and cannot be accessed by either parent without court approval. The courtroom burst into spontaneous applause, led by Ezekiel's great-grandmother Clementine, whose prayers had been answered in ways she'd never dared to imagine. Serafina was sobbing with relief and gratitude, finally understanding that her son would never again be used as a pawn in adult games. Ezekiel looked around at all the crying grown-ups and decided that perhaps it was time for him to say something that would help everyone understand what had really happened here today. Your Honor, he said in his clear 8-year-old voice, I think my daddy forgot that being a parent isn't about winning or losing. It's about loving someone so much that you'd rather lose everything than hurt them. He looked directly at his father, who was now flanked by FBI agents and wearing handcuffs that gleamed like chains of his own making. I still love you, Daddy, but I can't live with someone who doesn't know how to love me back. Maybe someday you'll learn how to be a real father, but until then, I'm going to stay with someone who already knows how to love me perfectly. The wisdom in those words hit the courtroom like a benediction, transforming what could have been a moment of triumph into something deeper. A lesson about forgiveness, about the nature of unconditional love, and about the remarkable capacity of children to teach adults what really matters. Judge Weatherby delivered her final ruling with the solemnity of someone who understood she was witnessing something historic. Custody remains with Serafina Thorne. Ezekiel will continue to live with his mother, where he clearly belongs. This court is adjourned. As the gavel fell for the final time, Ezekiel ran to his mother's arms, and the courtroom erupted in celebration of a justice so pure and complete that it felt like witnessing a miracle in real time. But as Cornelius was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to his son with eyes full of something that might have been regret, and whispered words that would haunt Ezekiel for years to come, words that would set up a confrontation far more dangerous than anything that had happened in that courtroom. "This isn't over, son. Someday you'll understand that I was trying to teach you how the real world works. And when that day comes, you'll realize you chose the wrong side." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, promising that while this battle was over, the war for Ezekiel's heart and soul was just beginning. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your blood, and sometimes love has to fight battles that courtrooms can never win. As mother and son walked out of that courthouse hand in hand, neither of them could imagine the challenges that lay ahead, challenges that would test their bond in ways that legal proceedings never could, and prove that sometimes the price of justice is eternal vigilance against those who would use love as a weapon. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 10 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 10 years to the day after Judge Weatherby's gavel had changed everything. 18-year-old Ezekiel Thorne, now a freshman at Harvard University studying pre-law with a full scholarship funded by his father's seized assets, almost threw it away without opening it. The return address was all too familiar: Federal Correctional Institution, Coleman, Florida. Cornelius had been writing letters for a decade. Most of them Serafina had intercepted and destroyed, protecting her son from the manipulative poison that dripped from every carefully crafted word. But this one was different. This one was addressed to Ezekiel Daniel Thorne, future heir to the Thorne Empire, and it had been delivered directly to his dormitory at Harvard Law School. Inside, written in his father's still elegant handwriting, were words that would shatter the peace they'd built over 10 years of healing and growth. "My dearest son, by the time you read this, I will have been released from federal prison after serving my sentence for crimes I committed in desperation, trying to secure your future in ways the system prevented me from doing legally. I know your mother has filled your head with lies about my motivations, but now that you're an adult, it's time you learned the truth. The $47 million trust fund that the court established for you? It's nothing compared to what I've been building for you while serving my time. I've been working with some very powerful people, very patient people, who understand that sometimes justice delayed is justice amplified. Your mother stole 10 years of our relationship, Ezekiel. 10 years of father-son bonding, 10 years of lessons about how real power works in this world, 10 years of preparing you to take your rightful place in the empire I've been building for you. But blood calls to blood, son. And whether you want to admit it or not, you have my intelligence, my drive, my understanding of how to win in a world that devours the weak. The recording you made as a child? The testimony that sent me to prison? That wasn't betrayal, that was genius. You played the long game better than I taught you. Meet me at the old courthouse where you became famous. Same courtroom, same time, 3 p.m. next Tuesday. Come alone. It's time for you to claim your inheritance and learn what I've really been planning for the last 10 years. Your father's love has never wavered. Cornelius Thorne. P.S. Ask your mother about the phone calls she's been receiving. Ask her about the private investigators who've been watching your dormitory. Ask her why she's been crying herself to sleep for the past month. Some secrets are too heavy for mothers to carry alone. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he read the letter twice, then 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of threat disguised as paternal affection. The boy who had once stood in that courtroom declaring his love for his mother was now a young man facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and dialed the number he'd been calling every Sunday for 10 years, the number that represented safety and unconditional love and everything his father had tried to destroy. "Mama," he said when Serafina answered on the first ring, her voice bright with the joy it always carried when he called, "We need to talk." The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. His mother had been waiting for this call, dreading it, preparing for it. The phone calls his father had mentioned, the private investigators, the tears, it was all true. "He's out, isn't he?" Serafina whispered, and in those 3 words, Ezekiel heard 10 years of carefully constructed peace crumbling like a sandcastle facing a tsunami. "Yes, Mama. And he wants to see me." What happened next would test everything they'd built together, everything Judge Weatherby's verdict had protected, everything that 8-year-old Ezekiel had fought so hard to preserve. Because Cornelius Thorne hadn't spent 10 years in federal prison learning humility or remorse. He'd spent those years planning his revenge, building new alliances, and crafting a web of legal and financial manipulation so complex that even FBI forensic accountants would struggle to unravel it. The war for Ezekiel's soul was about to begin in earnest, and this time, his father was playing for keeps. 3 days later, Birmingham. Serafina Thorne stood in the parking lot of the Jefferson County Courthouse, watching her 18-year-old son walk up those same concrete steps he'd climbed as an 8-year-old boy with a Batman backpack and unshakable faith in justice. Now he carried a leather messenger bag and the weight of adult understanding about how complicated the world could be. She wanted to run after him, to protect him the way she protected him for 10 years, but Ezekiel had asked her to let him handle this alone. "I need to face him as a man, Mama," he'd said. "I need to understand what he's really offering, and what it would cost." Inside Courtroom 3C, now empty except for dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight, Cornelius Thorne sat in the same chair where he'd once plotted to steal his son's childhood. 10 years in federal prison had aged him, carved lines around his eyes and silver through his hair, but it had also sharpened him into something more dangerous than he'd ever been before. He wasn't alone. Seated beside him was a woman Ezekiel didn't recognize, late 50s, impeccably dressed, with a kind of predatory intelligence that successful corporate lawyers wore. Like expensive perfume. Her business card, when she introduced herself, read Victoria Sterling, managing partner, Sterling and Associates, in elegant script that somehow made the name feel like a threat. "Ezekiel," Cornelius said, rising with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to project authority even in orange jumpsuits, "you've grown into everything I hoped you would become. Brilliant, principled, unafraid to fight for what you believe in. You're my son in every way that matters." The young man who'd once declared his love for his mother in this very room now stood silent, studying his father with eyes that had learned to see through manipulation disguised as affection. "Ms. Sterling here has been managing my affairs while I was away," Cornelius continued smoothly. "She's also Bartholomew Sterling's daughter, which makes this moment particularly satisfying. Sometimes the children succeed where their parents fail." Victoria Sterling smiled with the cold precision of a scalpel cutting through flesh. "Your father has asked me to present you with a business proposition, Ezekiel. One that could set you up for life, free you from the limitations of your current circumstances, and give you the power to shape the world instead of merely existing in it." She opened a leather portfolio and spread documents across the defendant's table where Serafina had once sat fighting for her son's future. Thorne Industries has been rebuilt from the ground up over the past 10 years. Legitimate businesses, clean money, legal operations across 17 states. Your father's conviction actually helped us. It removed him from day-to-day operations and allowed us to restructure everything properly. Ezekiel looked at the financial statements, the corporate structures, the projected earnings that would make him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. But he'd learned long ago that his father never offered anything without expecting something more valuable in return. "What's the catch?" he asked quietly. Cornelius laughed, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the courtroom walls. "Always straight to the point. I taught you well, even from a distance. The catch, son, is that we need your help with a small legal matter. Nothing criminal, nothing that would compromise your principles. Just a civil lawsuit that requires someone with your particular expertise in dealing with family court proceedings." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "You want me to sue Mama?" "Not sue her exactly," Victoria Sterling clarified with the precision of someone who made millions by finding loopholes in language. "We want you to petition for emancipation of your trust fund. You're 18 now, legally an adult, and there's no reason why you should have to wait until you're 25 to access your inheritance. The current trust structure was punitive, designed to keep you dependent on your mother's emotional manipulation." She pushed another document toward him, this one thick with legal terminology and dollar amounts that made his head spin. "Your trust fund currently holds approximately $53 million. But if you petition the court for early access, and if your father transfers his recently rebuilt assets into the same trust structure, you'd be looking at controlling approximately $200 million by your 20th birthday. $200 million. Enough money to never worry about student loans, to fund any charity he wanted, to make a real difference in the world. Enough money to ensure that his mother would never have to work another double shift, never have to worry about paying bills, never have to sacrifice anything ever again." But Ezekiel had learned to listen for what wasn't being said, to hear the spaces between words where the real truth lived. "And in exchange for this generous gift, what would you expect from me?" Cornelius leaned forward, his eyes blazing with the intensity that had once built a real estate empire and later destroyed it. "We need you to testify that your mother has been manipulating your relationship with me for the past 10 years. We need you to state, under oath, that you've been the victim of parental alienation, and that you want the opportunity to build a relationship with your father without interference." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 20 degrees. Here it was, the real offer. Betray the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him, destroy the relationship that had sustained him through childhood, and in exchange receive wealth beyond imagining. "The beauty of it," Victoria Sterling added with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly elegant chess move, "is that it's not even technically a lie. Your mother did keep you from your father. She did influence your opinions about him. She did create barriers to your relationship. We're just reframing those actions in a different context." Ezekiel looked around the courtroom where 8-year-old him had once stood up to speak truth to power, where he'd learned that love couldn't be bought or sold or negotiated. The irony was perfect and terrible. His father was asking him to use the same courtroom skills he'd learned as a child to destroy the woman who'd taught him to use them. "There's one more thing," Cornelius said, and something in his voice made Ezekiel's blood run cold. "Your mother's been having some financial difficulties lately. The hospital where she works is downsizing, and her position is being eliminated. She's too proud to tell you, of course, but she's been struggling to make ends meet." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison into an open wound. "The trust fund that was supposed to protect you both? It's tied up in legal restrictions that make it almost impossible to access for family emergencies. But if you were to gain control of those assets, the trap was perfect, diabolical in its simplicity. Accept the offer and betray his mother, or refuse and watch her struggle financially while he sat on millions of dollars he couldn't access to help her." But Ezekiel Thorne had learned something in his 18 years that his father had never understood, something that no amount of money could teach and no legal maneuvering could defeat. He'd learned that some choices reveal who you really are, and some prices are too high to pay regardless of what you might gain. What he said next would determine not just his own future, but whether the lessons he'd learned in this courtroom as a child could survive the test of adult temptation and manipulation. The answer would shock everyone in that room and prove that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money, it's character. If you think you know how this confrontation will end, think again. What Ezekiel does next will leave you speechless and prove that some bonds can never be broken, no matter how much money is offered to destroy them. The next few minutes will change everything, and you won't believe the twist that's coming. Ezekiel stood up slowly, walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot where his mother was waiting, and spoke words that would echo through that courtroom for the second time in his life. 10 years ago, I stood in this room and told a judge that real love means choosing someone every single day, even when it's hard. I said that real love is when someone fights for you even when the whole world says they can't win. He turned to face his father, this man who'd spent a decade in prison plotting revenge instead of learning love, and his voice carried the same clarity it had possessed when he was 8 years old and brave enough to speak truth to power. "You're offering me $200 million to betray the person who taught me what love actually means. But here's what you still don't understand. Even after all these years, I already have something worth more than all the money in the world. I have a mother who would die before she'd ask me to choose between her and my principles." Cornelius's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on a summer afternoon. "You're making a mistake, son. A mistake that will cost you everything." "No, Daddy," Ezekiel replied, using the childhood name deliberately, purposefully, as a reminder of who he'd once been and who he'd chosen to become. "You're the one who's been making mistakes. For 18 years, you've been trying to buy something that was never for sale. You tried to buy custody, you tried to buy justice, and now you're trying to buy my betrayal. But love isn't a transaction. Love is a choice." He picked up the documents Victoria Sterling had spread across the table and tore them in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall like snow onto the courtroom floor. "I choose my mother. I choose love over money, truth over manipulation, integrity over wealth. And if that means I never see a penny of your blood money, then so be it." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Cornelius Thorne's carefully constructed plans crumbling like ancient stone. Victoria Sterling looked like a woman watching her most important case collapse in real time, while Cornelius himself seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. But Ezekiel wasn't finished. He had one more truth to deliver, one final lesson for the man who'd never learned that some things couldn't be bought or sold or stolen. "You know what the real tragedy is, Daddy? All these years, all this plotting and scheming and trying to win, you could have just called. You could have just said you were sorry. You could have just asked for forgiveness and tried to be a real father instead of a business adversary." His voice broke slightly, revealing the 18-year-old boy beneath the mature exterior. "I would have given you a relationship for free. All you had to do was love me without conditions, without ulterior motives, without treating me like a commodity to be traded." Cornelius finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a snarl than actual speech. "You'll regret this decision, Ezekiel. When your mother can't pay her bills, when you're drowning in student debt, when you realize that principles don't keep you warm at night, you'll remember this moment and wish you'd been smarter." Ezekiel smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 8-year-old boy who'd once declared his love for his mother in this very courtroom. "Maybe. But I'd rather be poor and principled than rich and empty. I'd rather struggle with someone who loves me than live in luxury with someone who sees me as a profit margin." He walked toward the courtroom door, then paused and turned back one final time. "Goodbye, Daddy. I hope someday you figure out what you've been missing all these years. And when you do, if you ever want to have a real conversation about being father and son instead of adversaries, you know where to find me." The door closed behind him with the finality of a chapter ending, leaving Cornelius and Victoria Sterling alone in the courtroom where justice had triumphed once again, not through legal maneuvering or financial manipulation, but through the simple power of love choosing itself over everything else. Outside in the parking lot, Serafina saw her son emerge from the courthouse and knew from his expression that their family had survived another test, another attempt to tear apart what they'd built together through sacrifice and devotion and unshakable faith in each other. When Ezekiel reached the car, she didn't ask what had happened. She simply opened her arms, and he fell into them the way he had when he was 8 years old and the world felt too big and complicated to navigate alone. "I love you, Mama," he whispered against her shoulder, and she knew that no amount of money could ever buy what they had, a bond forged in truth, strengthened by adversity, and proven unbreakable by the passage of time. But as they drove away from the courthouse, neither of them saw the black sedan that pulled out of the parking garage to follow them at a discreet distance. Neither of them noticed the telephoto lens capturing their every move, or the small recording device that had captured every word of the conversation in Courtroom 3C. Because Cornelius Thorne hadn't spent 10 years in federal prison learning to accept defeat gracefully. He'd spent those years learning patience, learning to think several moves ahead, learning that sometimes the most devastating attacks come not from the front, but from directions you never see coming. The war for Ezekiel's soul was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous battle was yet to begin, a battle that would test whether love could survive not just financial temptation, but the kind of systematic destruction that only comes from someone who knows exactly where to aim for maximum damage. And Cornelius Thorne was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't money or power or legal manipulation. It's patience combined with intimate knowledge of your enemy's greatest weakness. The real game was just beginning. 6 months later, Harvard Law School. The package arrived on a Friday afternoon in March, delivered by courier to Ezekiel's dormitory with no return address and a note that simply read, "For my grandson, with love and admiration. Grandmother Evangeline." Inside was a first-edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, inscribed with elegant handwriting that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. Justice is a luxury that only the naive believe exists without cost. Your father tried to teach you this lesson through kindness. I will teach it through consequences. EPT. Evangeline Pemberton Thorne. His father's second wife, who had disappeared from their lives after Cornelius's arrest, taking with her millions in hidden assets and a grudge that had been festering for 10 years. The woman who had stood by while Cornelius planned to send an 8-year-old boy to boarding school just to avoid inconvenience. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he opened the book to find newspaper clippings tucked between the pages like poisonous bookmarks. Headlines that made his world tilt on its axis. Local nurse under investigation for prescription drug theft. Serafina Thorne, hero or criminal? Hospital worker accused of selling painkillers to fund gambling addiction. The articles were recent, dated within the last 2 weeks, each one containing enough truth mixed with lies to be devastatingly believable. Photos of his mother leaving the hospital looking exhausted and defeated, quotes from unnamed sources describing suspicious behavior, accusations that painted her as everything she'd never been. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello, Ezekiel." The voice was cultured Southern, dripping with false grandmotherly warmth that made his skin crawl. "I trust you received my little gift. What do you want?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. "What I've always wanted, darling boy. Justice. Your father spent 10 years in federal prison for the crime of trying to provide for his son. Your mother destroyed our family with her lies and manipulation. And you, sweet naive you, have been living off blood money for a decade while believing you're morally superior." Evangeline's laugh was like broken crystal. "But here's what you don't know, precious child. The trust fund that's been paying for your Harvard education? The money that bought your mother's house, that paid for her medical bills when she had that little cancer scare 5 years ago? Every penny of it came from illegal offshore accounts that your dear father established before his arrest." The room started spinning. "That's impossible. The FBI seized all his assets. The trust fund was legitimate." "Oh, my dear boy. The FBI seized the assets they could find. But your father was far cleverer than those federal investigators ever imagined. He'd been moving money for years, long before they started paying attention. The clean money they used to establish your trust? It was all a beautiful shell game." Ezekiel sank into his desk chair, the phone pressed against his ear like a lifeline to a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that every scholarship, every opportunity, every moment of moral superiority you've enjoyed has been paid for with dirty money. You've been living a lie for 10 years, sweetheart. And now it's time to pay the price for your family's sins." Alabama. Your mother will spend the next 10 years in federal prison, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you could have saved her but chose your pride instead. The line went dead, leaving Ezekiel alone with the wreckage of everything he'd thought he knew about his life. But as he sat there staring at the forged newspaper articles and feeling his world crumble around him, something his mother had taught him long ago echoed in his memory. "When people try to control you with fear, baby, that's when you know they're lying about something important." Evangeline Pemberton Thorne had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that 10 years of love and trust could be destroyed by 72 hours of fear and manipulation. She'd forgotten that the bond between Serafina and Ezekiel had been forged in courtrooms and tested by fire, proven unbreakable by forces far more powerful than newspaper headlines and financial blackmail. What she hadn't counted on was that if you think this family has been through enough, you haven't seen anything yet. What Ezekiel discovers next about his father's real plan will shock you to your core and prove that some people will destroy everything beautiful in the world just to prove they can. Subscribe now because the next revelation will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Ezekiel didn't call his mother. Instead, he called someone else, someone whose number he'd memorized years ago but never thought he'd need to use. FBI Special Agent Victoria Hawthorne answered on the second ring. Agent Hawthorne. This is Ezekiel Thorne. I think my family is being set up for crimes we didn't commit, and I have evidence that my father's criminal organization is still operating. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. When Agent Hawthorne spoke again, her voice carried the sharpness of someone who'd been waiting for this call for 10 years. Mr. Thorne, I think it's time we had a very long conversation. FBI Field Office, Birmingham. 2 hours later. The conference room felt like a war room, filled with files, photos, and evidence boards that painted a picture of criminal conspiracy spanning 2 decades. Agent Hawthorne sat across from Ezekiel, her laptop open to financial records that made his head spin with their complexity. Your stepmother made a critical error, she said, pulling up bank records that looked like something from a spy thriller. She assumed we stopped investigating your father's criminal network when we arrested him. In reality, we've been tracking the money for 10 years, waiting for someone to make a move that would give us jurisdiction to act. She turned the laptop screen toward him, showing a web of financial transactions that looked like a spider's web designed by a criminal mastermind. Evangeline Pemberton Thorne has been operating what we call a patience conspiracy, a long-term criminal enterprise designed to destroy your family psychologically while enriching herself financially. How long have you known? We suspected for years, but we needed proof. Your stepmother has been incredibly careful, using legitimate businesses to launder money, creating fake insurance settlements that were technically legal, establishing shell companies that existed just long enough to transfer funds before disappearing. Agent Hawthorne pulled out a thick file marked Operation Family Tree in bold red letters. The money your mother has been receiving? It's clean now. Every transaction was structured to be completely legal by the time it reached her. Evangeline was playing a 20-year game, using dirty money to create clean transactions that would eventually be used to frame your mother for crimes she didn't commit. But why? Why go to all this trouble just for revenge? The agent's smile was grim. Because your father didn't just hide $47 million from federal investigators. He had closer to $300 million, and Evangeline has been managing those assets for 10 years, building them into something approaching $1 billion. The number hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. $1 billion. Enough money to buy politicians, judges, prosecutors. Your trust fund was never about providing for you, Agent Hawthorne continued. It was about creating a legal framework that could eventually be used to legitimize money laundering on an unprecedented scale. When you turned 25 and gained full control of those assets, the plan was to use your name and reputation to establish Thorne Industries as a legitimate empire built on criminal foundations. She pulled up another screen, this one showing surveillance photos of Ezekiel over the past several years, at school, studying in the library, walking with friends, visiting his mother. They've been watching you your entire life, waiting for you to become the perfect front man for their operation. An innocent, principled young man with no knowledge of criminal activity, no involvement in his father's original crimes, and a reputation for integrity that would deflect any federal investigation. They wanted to use me as a cover for money laundering? They wanted to use you as the face of a criminal empire that would make your father's original crimes look like petty theft in comparison. Thorne Industries was going to be the legitimate front for international money laundering, arms dealing, and political corruption on a scale that would make some small countries envious. Ezekiel felt sick. And if I'd accepted their offer 6 months ago? You would have unknowingly signed documents making you the legal owner of assets derived from human trafficking, drug cartels, and international weapon sales. By the time you figured out what was happening, you'd be so deeply implicated that cooperation with federal authorities would be your only option, and they'd own you completely. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing in other offices. Ezekiel stared at the evidence boards, trying to process the magnitude of what his family had become without his knowledge. "There's something else," Agent Hawthorne said quietly. "The reason your stepmother is making her move now, the reason she's willing to expose the operation by framing your mother, she's dying." "What?" "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She has maybe 6 months to live. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about securing the money before she dies and ensuring that her biological children inherit the empire she's built using your name." Agent Hawthorne pulled out one final file, this one labeled Beneficiaries. "Evangeline has 2 sons from her first marriage, both of whom have been living in Switzerland for the past decade, managing European operations for Thorne Industries. When she dies, they inherit control of everything, unless you voluntarily sign over your trust fund to prevent your mother from going to prison for crimes that Evangeline herself committed." The trap was even more sophisticated than Ezekiel had realized. Not just blackmail, but a carefully orchestrated plan to transfer a billion-dollar criminal empire to Evangeline's biological children, while using his mother as leverage and his name as legitimization. "What can we do?" Agent Hawthorne's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "We're going to give them exactly what they want, with one small modification. You're going to agree to their demands, sign their papers." She slid a small device across the table that looked like a button from an expensive shirt. "We've been waiting 10 years for someone on the inside to give us access to their operation. You're going to be our Trojan horse." "And my mother?" "Will be completely protected. The charges against her will be revealed as fabricated evidence created by a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. She'll probably end up testifying for the prosecution in one of the biggest criminal trials in federal history." Ezekiel picked up the tiny recording device, feeling its weight in his palm like he was holding the scales of justice itself. "When do we start?" "We start by calling your stepmother and telling her you've decided to cooperate. Then we set up a meeting where she'll explain exactly how their operation works, who their partners are, and where they've hidden enough evidence to put them away for life." Agent Hawthorne leaned forward, her eyes blazing with the intensity of someone who'd spent a decade building a case that would reshape organized crime prosecution. "Your father thought he could use the legal system to steal your childhood. Your stepmother thought she could use emotional blackmail to steal your future. But they forgot one important thing." "What's that?" "They forgot that sometimes the people they're trying to manipulate have been learning how to fight back their entire lives. And sometimes, justice doesn't come from courtrooms or legal procedures. Sometimes it comes from children who grew up watching their mothers sacrifice everything for love, and who learned that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't money or power or fear, it's truth." Ezekiel smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 8-year-old boy who'd once stood in a courtroom and declared war on injustice with nothing but courage and love as his weapons. "Let's bring them down." The final battle for the Thorne family's soul was about to begin, and this time, Ezekiel wasn't going to court as a child seeking justice. He was going as a man ready to deliver it. But what none of them knew was that Cornelius Thorne had one final card to play, one last secret that would test whether love could survive not just criminal conspiracy and financial blackmail, but the kind of devastating revelation that changes everything you thought you knew about the people you trust most. The truth about Serafina Thorne was about to surface, and it would prove that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about the people we love most in the world. The building rose from downtown Birmingham like a monument to legitimate success, all glass and steel and corporate respectability. But Ezekiel knew now that it was built on a foundation of blood money, international crime, and decades of carefully orchestrated deception. The wire taped to his chest felt like a heartbeat against his ribs as he rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, where his father and stepmother were waiting to claim their final victory. The recording device Agent Hawthorne had given him was smaller than a dime but powerful enough to capture conversations 3 rooms away. More importantly, it was connected to a federal task force that included agents from the FBI, DEA, Treasury Department, and Interpol, because what the Thorne family had built over the past decade crossed international boundaries and federal jurisdictions. Like Cornelius stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, his reflection ghost-like against the darkening sky. 10 years in federal prison had changed him, carved away the last vestiges of humanity and left behind something that looked like a successful businessman but felt like a predator wearing an expensive suit. Evangeline sat behind an antique desk that probably cost more than most people's houses, her perfectly styled hair and elegant clothing unable to hide the ravages of the cancer that was eating her alive from the inside. Death had made her beautiful in the way that terminal illness sometimes does, sharp, ethereal, and absolutely terrifying in its urgency. "Ezekiel," Cornelius said without turning from the window, "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. It would have been such a waste to destroy your mother unnecessarily." "I want to see the evidence," Ezekiel said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins like ice water. "I want to see exactly what you have on her before I sign anything." Evangeline smiled with the satisfaction of a spider watching a fly walk into her web. "Of course, darling. Due diligence is so important in family business matters." She opened a leather portfolio that looked like something from a legal thriller, spreading documents across the desk with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Bank records, prescription logs, surveillance photos, witness statements, enough fabricated evidence to send Serafina to federal prison for 20 years. "Your mother has been remarkably predictable," Evangeline said, her southern accent growing thicker as excitement took hold. "Every month for the past 5 years, she's received a direct deposit from Mercy Medical Solutions, what she believes to be an insurance settlement from her cancer treatment. In reality, it's been payments for stolen prescription medications that we've been selling through a network of pain management clinics across the Southeast." She pointed to a column of numbers that made Ezekiel's stomach turn. $43,000 per month, for 60 months. Over $2.5 million in what federal prosecutors will argue is payment for pharmaceutical theft and distribution. The beauty is that every transaction is meticulously documented, every deposit corresponds exactly with missing drug inventories, and every payment was made to her personal account with her full knowledge and consent. Except she didn't know what the money was really for. "Can you prove that?" Cornelius asked, finally turning from the window with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the son he'd once claimed to love. "Can you prove that a 30-year veteran nurse didn't understand the significance of receiving monthly payments from a medical company that doesn't actually exist? Can you prove that she never questioned why her insurance settlement was ongoing for 5 years when her treatment ended in 6 months? The trap was perfect, diabolical in its attention to detail. Serafina had been accepting money that looked completely legitimate, for reasons that made perfect sense, from sources that appeared totally credible. By the time anyone questioned the transactions, she would be so deeply implicated that claiming ignorance would sound like the desperate lie of someone caught red-handed. "But here's the really beautiful part," Evangeline continued with the gleeful malice of someone savoring a masterpiece of revenge. "The prescription logs show that your mother has been accessing controlled substances far beyond her patient load requirements. OxyContin, fentanyl, morphine, quantities that could only be explained by systematic theft and distribution." She pulled out medical records that looked authentic enough to fool federal investigators. "And the witness statements, well, they're from very convincing actors who will swear under oath that they purchased pills directly from Serafina Thorne in hospital parking lots, church parking lots, even at your high school graduation ceremony." Ezekiel felt the room spinning around him like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The evidence was overwhelming, professional, and completely fabricated, but convincing enough to destroy his mother's life even if she eventually proved her innocence. "What do you want?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Cornelius sat down across from his son, and for a moment his expression softened into something that might have been genuine paternal affection, If you didn't know that everything about him was calculated manipulation designed to achieve maximum psychological impact. I want my family back, son. I want the 10 years that were stolen from us by lies and legal maneuvering. I want you to understand that everything I've done, every crime, every scheme, every moment of what you call manipulation, has been about securing your future in a world that devours the weak and rewards the strong. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity of a man delivering a final speech. Thorn Industries is worth $1.2 billion, Ezekiel. We own politicians in 17 states, federal judges in 3 circuits, and law enforcement officials in more jurisdictions than you can imagine. We control import-export operations that move money across international boundaries like water flowing downhill. We are, quite literally, too big to fail and too powerful to prosecute. And you want me to be the face of this criminal empire? I want you to be the heir to this criminal empire, Evangeline corrected with surgical precision. When I die, and I will die very soon, control of everything passes to you. Not to Cornelius, who's still a convicted felon. Not to my biological sons, who are foreigners with questionable legal status. To you, Ezekiel Thorn, Harvard law student, American citizen, and the most morally upstanding young man anyone has ever met. She stood up slowly, the cancer making her movements careful and deliberate. You'll spend 5 years learning the business, building relationships with our partners, establishing yourself as a legitimate businessman. Then you'll gradually take control of operations, clean up the criminal elements, and transform Thorn Industries into the kind of legal enterprise that dominates Fortune 500 lists. And if I refuse? Your mother goes to federal prison for crimes she didn't commit, you lose your trust fund to legal fees defending her, and you spend the rest of your life knowing that you could have saved her but chose your principles instead, Cornelius said with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and terror. Here was the moment that would define not just Ezekiel's future, but the future of organized crime in America. Accept, and become the front man for a billion-dollar criminal conspiracy. Refuse, and watch his mother pay the price for his moral inflexibility. But Ezekiel had learned something in his 18 years that his father and stepmother had never understood, something that Agent Hawthorne was counting on and that would determine whether justice could triumph over criminal conspiracy. He'd learned that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't money or threats or fabricated evidence. They're truth and courage and the willingness to trust that love is stronger than fear. What he said next would bring down a criminal empire and prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, even when those voices have grown up and learned to fight back with federal law enforcement and recording devices instead of just courtroom testimony. I need to call my mother, Ezekiel said quietly. I need to tell her what you're offering and let her help me decide. Evangeline's laugh was like breaking crystal. Absolutely not. This conversation stays between family. Your mother has caused enough damage to this family. My mother is my family, Ezekiel interrupted with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 10 years learning the difference between blood relations and chosen family. Everything else is just biology and legal paperwork. He pulled out his phone with hands that were steady as bedrock despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I'm calling her right now. I'm going to tell her exactly what you've offered me and exactly what you're threatening her with. And then I'm going to let her help me decide whether we fight this together or whether I sacrifice everything we believe in to protect her from consequences she doesn't deserve. Ezekiel, don't. Cornelius started to stand, panic flickering across his features like flames in sudden wind. Mama. Ezekiel said into the phone, his voice carrying clearly through the executive office and directly into the recording device that was transmitting everything to a federal task force waiting 3 blocks away. It's me. I'm here with Daddy and Evangeline, and they've just offered me $1.2 billion to help them run a criminal empire that launders money for drug cartels and international arms dealers. The silence that followed was deafening. Evangeline's face went white as fresh snow, while Cornelius looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. They've also threatened to frame you for prescription drug theft unless I agree to become the legitimate front for their illegal operations, Ezekiel continued with the calm precision of someone reading evidence into a court record. They have fake bank records, fabricated witness statements, and forged medical documents that would make it look like you've been stealing and selling drugs for the past 5 years. Serafina's voice came through the phone speaker, clear and strong and absolutely unafraid. "Baby, are you recording this conversation?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"The FBI is listening to every word." "Good. Then I want them to hear this. I would rather spend the rest of my life in federal prison for crimes I didn't commit than watch my son become the kind of person who values money over morality. And I want your father and stepmother to understand that they have spent 10 years completely misunderstanding what kind of family we really are." Her voice grew stronger, taking on the steel-edged determination that had carried them through a decade of legal battles and family trauma. "We don't negotiate with terrorists, even when they share our last name. We don't compromise our principles, even when the consequences are terrible. And we sure as hell don't let bullies win, even when they're wearing expensive suits and hiding behind billion-dollar bank accounts." "Ezekiel," she continued, and her voice was filled with the kind of love that could move mountains and stop armies, "come home. Come home right now. We'll face whatever they throw at us the same way we faced everything else, together, with truth on our side and love in our hearts." The phone call ended, leaving behind a silence so complete that you could hear the building's ventilation system like breathing. Ezekiel looked at his father and stepmother, these people who'd spent years plotting his destruction and manipulation, and he smiled with the same clarity he'd possessed when he was 8 years old and brave enough to speak truth to power. "Did you get all that?" he asked the empty air, speaking directly to the FBI agents listening through his wire. Agent Hawthorne's voice came through his hidden earpiece like the voice of justice itself, every word. "FBI. Nobody move." The executive office exploded into chaos as federal agents burst through doors that Ezekiel hadn't even noticed, surrounding Cornelius and Evangeline with weapons drawn and badges displayed like shields of righteous authority. The culmination of a 10-year investigation played out in real time, with search warrants, arrest warrants, and asset seizure orders that would dismantle a billion-dollar criminal empire in a matter of hours. But the most beautiful moment came when Ezekiel walked out of that building, past the news cameras and federal investigators and corporate lawyers, and saw his mother waiting for him on the sidewalk exactly where she'd promised to be, ready to face whatever came next with the same unshakable faith in each other that had carried them through every previous battle. The war for Ezekiel's soul was finally over. Love had won. Truth had triumphed. And justice had been served not through legal maneuvering or financial manipulation, but through the simple power of a family that refused to be broken by people who mistook cruelty for strength and money for power. As they walked away from the courthouse hand in hand, neither of them knowing that this was just the beginning of a story that would span generations and prove that some bonds are truly unbreakable, Ezekiel had one final thought about the man who tried to buy his betrayal and the woman who tried to threaten his love. They'd spent 10 years learning how to manipulate, how to scheme, how to use money and fear as weapons. But they'd never learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't wealth or influence or criminal conspiracy. It's a mother's love for her child and a child's willingness to fight for the person who taught him what love really means. The story of the Thorne family was far from over. But for the first time in 18 years, it was a story about love triumphing over fear, truth defeating lies, and justice proving that sometimes David really can defeat Goliath, especially when David has the FBI on his side and the kind of courage that can only come from being loved unconditionally by someone who would rather face prison than watch you compromise your soul.